to cool.
Ghostbusters!
When I was a kid, this was one of those movies that I would watch on a loop over and over again, because I was just enamored with the great special effects, the creature designs, and the very clever concept of a group of friends starting up a ghost catching business, essentially being the paranormal version of exterminators, only to get in way over their heads against immortal, all-powerful beings from other dimensions, but still somehow managed to save the day, either because they had the tools and the talent, or they were just extremely lucky. Every other movie I had ever watched featuring ghosts, stuff like Poltergeist and the Amityville Horror, always featured people running in terror from their ethereal tormentors. But here we had a group of guys willing to meet those gruesome ghoulies head on and put them in their place.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass!
Ghostbusters was released before I was even born, but in retrospect, it's easy to imagine how this could have been a flop, as it must have sounded odd to audiences that the same group of comedic actors responsible for movies like Caddyshack and Stripes would be releasing a film that blended comedy with the supernatural and even some light horror elements. But the end result is what I and many people view as a perfect movie. One of those movies you just couldn't imagine being any different or any better. The characters are memorable and the performances by everyone in the central cast are fantastic. Plus there was a fun and engaging story, great creature designs, and what at the time at least were some cutting-edge special effects that honestly still look pretty damn good to this day. And of course the Ghostbusters theme song is one of the all-time greats, and is instantly recognizable more than 40 years later. Plus, this is one of the most quotable movies ever made.
I collect spores, molds, and fungus.
He slimed me.
That's a big Twinkie.
You know, you are a real humanitarian.
I don't think he's human.
What an asshole.
All of these elements coming together is precisely why Ghostbusters was the highest grossing movie of 1984, beating out other classics like Beverly Hills Cop, Gremlins, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So yeah, moviegoers were eating pretty good back in 1984. Ghostbusters was so awesome, in fact, that of course there had to be plenty of merchandising. As a kid, I myself had Ghostbusters t-shirts, action figures, a lunchbox, VHS tapes, and my 6th birthday party even had a Ghostbusters theme. From that original film spawned a bunch of sequels, multiple animated TV shows, a comic book series, and a highly successful toy line that rivaled even the likes of the Ninja Turtles. And of course, there had to be video games. Lots and lots of video games, spanning from the NES up to the PS4 and everything in between, with some of these games being downright awesome, and some of them being so bad they almost make you wish that you were a ghost. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a big bunch of Ghostbusters games, and find out which ones are worth playing, and which ones belong 6 feet under. So buckle up, because things are about to get slimy.
Ray, come in please.
I feel so funky.
Let's kick things off on a positive note with Ghostbusters on the Sega Genesis from 1990, which was published by Sega and developed by Compile, who are best known for the myriad of great shoot-'em-ups that they produced, but when they dabbled in other genres, the results were usually pretty good. The story in this game actually takes place shortly after the events of the original Ghostbusters film, when there's been a big drop in business after the defeat of Gozer, since paranormal activity in New York City has all but stopped entirely, which is presumably why we never see Winston in this game, as he is technically a paid employee of the Ghostbusters, and not one of the founding members who actually own the business.
If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say.
Anyway, this period of normalcy doesn't last very long, as at the start of the game, a whole bunch of locations dotted around NYC start reporting infestations of ghosts and other paranormal beings. And you can select one of the 3 playable Ghostbusters to bust some heads. In a spiritual sense, of course. Each of them has slightly varying stats in terms of offense, defense, and movement speed, but there's not a huge difference between them. And this is a fairly straightforward run-and-gun action platformer, where each stage is quite large and filled with a variety of colorful enemies. You start out with a fairly basic shot as your standard attack, But as you defeat and capture ghosts and find the money that's lying around in each stage, you can buy upgrades that give you more effective weapons, as well as increasing your health and your firepower. Each stage is essentially a big maze, though they all feature at least one mid-boss. But some of them feature as many as 4, and you'll need to defeat all of them before you can move on to the final boss of that stage. And on the whole, this game is pretty solid. It's not exactly what I would call an S-tier platformer, but the controls are nice and tight, the challenge is fair, and it's a good bit of fun. When playing on the normal difficulty, you're given 10 continues, and there are quite a lot of health power-ups to find. But on the hard difficulty, your continues are cut in half, and you take more damage, which does make for quite the challenge. The best part though is definitely the boss battles, as they each require a different strategy to clear. And the designs of some of these enemies are pretty damn cool. Up to and including our old pal Stay Puft, who tries to smash you to bits as you make your way to the top of the skyscraper he's terrorizing.
Well, there's something you don't see every day.
And while I'm on the subject, the designs of the standard enemies are really cool too, seemingly taking a bit of inspiration from the toy line. And the Ghostbusters themselves have a funny kind of bobblehead appearance, and they're very recognizable as their real-life counterparts. The stages themselves though look pretty bland for the most part, not very much color or detail, which I get that this is an early release for the console and it's only a 4 meg game, but there are other 4 meg games released by Sega around the same time that at least had more colorful backgrounds and a bit of scrolling. Not so for Ghostbusters though, so the visuals are a bit of a mixed bag. Nice character and enemy designs, but underwhelming stages. The sound design, on the other hand, is quite good. Particularly the soundtrack, which features more than a few catchy tunes, which isn't surprising when considering Compile's great track record for including some solid music in their games. So while I wouldn't play it before the likes of Shinobi or Sonic the Hedgehog, Ghostbusters on the Genesis is an above average offering and would have definitely been in my Genesis library had I had one in 1990. And I recommend giving it a shot if you haven't already. If nothing else, it is light years better than anything else that passed for a Ghostbusters game at the time.
Well, that wasn't such a chore now, was it?
The other game that's simply titled Ghostbuster is the one that was developed and published by Activision, and at this point, it's a fairly infamous game for how bad it is, which is handy because that means I won't have to dwell on it too much. The most well-known version is the one on the NES, but it actually started out as a Commodore 64 game, and was later ported to several other microcomputers and home consoles like the Atari 2600 and the Sega Master System, a version which was actually published by Sega themselves and developed by Compile. But aside from differences in the visuals and audio quality, they all feature essentially the same gameplay, which is, in a word, awful. There are some kind of cool ideas here, like buying lots of equipment and upgrades with the money you make from catching ghosts. The giant ghost trap on the top of your car being an especially cool premise, which would eventually resurface many years later. And being able to drive the Ecto-1 is a good instinct at least, but the implementation is just no fun to play. Essentially, you just drag the Ghostbusters logo around the screen, waiting for a building to light up so you can drive over to it, which itself is an exercise in frustration as you routinely collide with other cars, which costs you plenty of money, and you'll also probably run out of gas a time or two, which again costs money and wastes time. Once you're actually at the building, you try to catch a few ghosts before returning to the overworld map and starting the process all over again. And you'll do this countless times until you can finally go to the Zool building for one final, thumb-destroying stage. And the thing is that this really isn't a very difficult game once you get the hang of it, and it also ends up being a rather short game. But it is still painfully boring, tedious, and at times very frustrating. On top of which, the graphics are terrible and the sound design is the very definition of irritating, making this one of the worst games I've personally ever played, whether that be the NES, Master System, Atari 2600, or any other versions. When it comes to games simply titled Ghostbusters, avoid this one like you'd avoid crossing the streams, as playing it could have dire consequences.
Try to imagine all life as you know it stopping instantaneously and every molecule in your body exploding at the speed of light.
Total protonic reversal.
All right, that's bad.
Ghostbusters. Yes, we're back.
In the summer of 1989, Ghostbusters 2 hit theaters everywhere, and was expected to be a smash hit just like the first film was. But instead, it was only a moderate hit, still making a huge profit, but finishing in 7th place for the year, behind movies like Lethal Weapon 2, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and the movie that absolutely dominated 1989.
I'm Batman.
It's a somewhat divisive movie, with some people loving it, and some people hating it for following more or less the exact same formula as the first movie. I myself am someone who loves certain aspects of this movie, but generally don't enjoy it nearly as much as the first one. When I was a kid though, this is another movie that I'd watch on a loop, because I love the creature designs and effects, the music, and of course...
Slime! It's a river of slime!
The story about the spirit of an evil 16th century tyrant trapped inside of a painting and feeding on all of the negative emotions that New Yorkers can muster up is at least pretty creative. But Vigo doesn't seem like nearly the threat that Gozer was, even though he looks pretty cool, and having Max von Sydow's voice definitely helps with the intimidation factor. It's a pretty formulaic movie, with the Ghostbusters once again having to establish that there are indeed ghosts infesting New York and that their services are needed, even as the mayor's office and snooty bureaucrats stand in their way, ultimately locking them up before something comes along that threatens to destroy the entire city, which again has Dana Baird at the center of it for some reason, giving her and Peter an opportunity to reignite their lost love. In the end, the Ghostbusters come to Dana's aid, defeat the otherworldly threat, and save New York. At least for now. And yeah, while the story itself is really predictable and follows all of the same beats as its predecessor, I still love the various ghosts and monsters, the excessive amounts of slime, the Statue of Liberty being piloted by an NES Advantage is really cool, and I've always enjoyed the soundtrack featuring the likes of Run DMC, Glenn Frey, and Bobby Brown. Plus, there are still some really good jokes peppered in here and there, as well as some very quotable lines, mostly from Egon.
You mean you never even had a slinky?
We had part of a slinky, but I straightened it.
Bet those science chicks really dig that large cranium of yours, huh?
I think they're more interested in my epididymis. Let's see what happens when we take away the puppy.
So while it might not have the legacy of the first movie, Ghostbusters 2 is still a pretty fun watch, and it also had a handful of video game adaptations. Again, the one that most people will be familiar with is Activision's Ghostbusters 2 on the NES, which was released in 1990, which, in a total reversal from the films, is significantly better than its predecessor. But does that necessarily mean it's a good game?
No.
Yeah, it's still pretty bad, though not unplayable really. For the most part, it's broken down into 3 kinds of stages. Side-scrolling run and gun, driving stages, and a huge chunk of the game where you take control of the Statue of Liberty. In the side-scrolling stages, you're tasked with running to the left of the screen and shooting ghosts with slime, while collecting Ghostbusters logos, which give you an extra life after you collect 20 of them. And some enemies are invulnerable to your slime shot, but you can use a limited amount of ghost traps to suck them up. Otherwise, you'll just have to avoid them. And that's pretty much it for these stages. Just make it to the end before time runs out. These aren't god-awful stages, mind you, but they lack any kind of variety, and before long they get pretty boring. After that, there are the driving stages, which are at least a little more exciting. As you cruise down the street in the Ecto-1, you'll again be firing slime at the various ghosts that populate the screen, while dodging obstacles and hitting speed boosts to clear big jumps. There are plenty more logos to collect, but you can also shoot slime bubbles out of the sky, which drop coins. And collecting the coins grants you some very useful power-ups, like strengthening your shot or giving you a temporary shield. So these stages aren't terrible, but again, they get a bit tedious before too long. and they can also be kind of frustrating. Finally, there are the Statue of Liberty stages, and these damn things drag on for what feels like forever. If the other stages can get a bit tedious, these are like pulling teeth. It's broken down into two separate segments. One where you're walking through New York Bay, and another where you're walking through the city. And the goal is the same as the run and gun stages. Just make it to the end before time runs out. All while shooting down, or at least attempting to shoot down, a legion of ghosts that fly above you. And this is definitely my least favorite part of this game. Except maybe for the fact that when you do finally make it to the end, instead of having a boss fight with Vigo, which is what you'd expect to happen, there's just a cutscene where the Ghostbusters shoot his painting with slime. Which really sucks, because this asshole taunts you all throughout the game, and then when you finally get to him, the game just sort of ends in a very anticlimactic fashion. So the gameplay, for the most part, is pretty bad. Nowhere near the shit show that the first game was, but still not a very enjoyable game at all. As for the graphics, I would have expected more from a late-release NES game. The visuals here are about as bland as the gameplay, and the sound design doesn't fare much better, only featuring maybe 3 different stage themes that repeat all throughout the game. And it wasn't long before I got tired of hearing them and was reaching for the mute button. Overall, another poor showing from Activision. But this is not the only Ghostbusters 2 game.
This is Peter Wicklein saying, see you then.
In 1989, there was also a Ghostbusters 2 game released for various microcomputers like the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and the Amiga, which is the version you're seeing here. And this, in my opinion, is significantly worse than the NES game. It's actually one of the worst games I've ever played. And at this point, my track record with the Amiga is pretty damn abysmal. In fact, if part of the point of these videos wasn't to find the worst games based on a franchise, I could safely avoid the Amiga altogether. Anyway, this is another game that's split into 3 different segments that feature completely different gameplay. In the first stage, you play as Ray being lowered into the sewers to discover the River of Slime. And on your way down, you'll need to avoid enemies, shoot them with your proton pack, or use a proton bomb kind of thing, which is especially handy. And you do have limited proton energies, so you need to use it kinda conservatively, while also trying your best to grab power-ups. The other ability you have is a green slime barrier type thing, which is your most useful item, as it can be damn near impossible to avoid all of these enemies. And the stage ends when you finally make it to the Slime River. And this stage controls like absolute garbage, and is just no fun at all to play. And it's followed by yet another painfully drawn out Statue of Liberty stage where you take control of fireballs that come out of the statue's torch, blasting enemies and protecting civilians until you finally make it to the museum, where you must then lower each Ghostbuster one at a time via a rope before swapping between them to take out Janos and Vigo and save baby Oscar. And once again, the game ends very abruptly and had me pondering why the hell I just put myself through that. This is the definition of a lazy, slapped-together movie tie-in game with very little in the way of redeeming qualities. Some of the visuals are at least okay, but the gameplay is terrible and the sound design is atrocious, mostly lacking any music at all and featuring some very irritating sound effects. Believe it or not, this is even worse than the NES game. And as if that wasn't bad enough, I soon discovered there's even an Atari 2600 version, which was released in 1992, which is just absurd, and I have to imagine it sold about 10 copies, because who in the hell was still buying 2600 games in 1992? Anyway, this version only features 2 stages, Ray being lowered into the sewers and the Statue of Liberty stage, both of which are no fun at all to play. I can't bitch about the graphics or sound because, you know, it's a 2600 game and there really isn't much point. But I will say that this is a game that really didn't need to be made. It's kind of like if they announced today that GTA 6 is getting a port to the PS2. I'm not sure there would be a huge market for it. Anyway, playing this will actually make you appreciate the first NES game in a way. because no matter how bad things get, they could always be worse.
Who you gonna call? Someone else.
Now, at the exact same time as the micro game, there was also a PC version released for DOS. And this one is also pretty bad, but not nearly as bad. For the most part, it's kind of a shooting gallery type of game, where you're in the foreground firing your proton pack at enemies in the background, while also dodging the projectiles they hurl at you. Kinda like NAM 1975 or The Punisher on the NES, except that each stage consists of a single screen and you're only ever trying to take out 1 or 2 enemies. As you blast them with your proton pack, their energy depletes, and when it's empty, they can be sucked into a trap that's already lying on the ground. The first stage takes place in the courthouse, where you have to capture the Scolari brothers. But after that, you're actually given the choice of a few different things you can do. There are more ghost catching stages, which you'll need to clear to earn the money that you need to progress the story. And there's a slime collecting stage, which you also need to clear, as it's only after you've collected enough slime that you can positively charge it with the CD player. Once you've got the positively charged slime and enough money, you can take control of the Statue of Liberty, in a bizarre stage where you actually use an NES controller to move its feet, with the main goal being not to crush any cars as you walk down the street. Which makes absolutely no sense, as in the movie, people obviously cleared the streets when they saw the Statue of Liberty walking around. Though I guess she did step on that one car anyway. After clearing the statue stage, you have one final shooting stage against Vigo, where first you soften him up with the proton pack and then send him back into the painting with the slime blower. And that's all she wrote. This is a pretty damn weird game, all things considered, but I actually didn't hate it. At the very least, it's significantly better than the micro game and the NES game. It's not necessarily a good game, mind you, but the designers did at least try to cram in as much stuff from the movie as they could, while still having something that's at least playable. As for the visuals, well, it's a 1989 DOS game. They're not gonna blow you away. But this is at least a fairly colorful game that features a bunch of locations from the movie as well as plenty of stills used in the cutscenes. The sound design, on the other hand, is a little baffling though, as the entire soundtrack is made up of 100% jazz piano music, which really doesn't fit at all, but I like it in a so bad it's good kind of way. This game is an oddity for sure, but I'm glad I played it. It's just weird enough to be mildly enjoyable. But you might be asking yourself, wasn't there at least one unironically good game based on Ghostbusters 2?
Freeman, would you get a stool specimen, please?
Business or personal?
Well, yes there was, in the form of New Ghostbusters 2, which was released for the Famicom in 1990 and the NES in 1991. But because Activision still held the license to Ghostbusters in North America, this one remained exclusive to Japan and Europe. Which is a real bummer because this game is actually really good. It was developed by HAL Laboratory of Kirby fame and features 5 playable characters, those being the 4 Ghostbusters themselves and Louis Tully, who I guess you could say is an honorary 5th Ghostbuster. You select 2 characters to play as, one that you'll be controlling and the other being a CPU-controlled ally, and you run through 5 stages based on locations from the movie, capturing ghosts and taking down bosses. The controls are exceedingly simple. One button fires your proton pack, which locks enemies in place, and the other button throws out the ghost trap to suck them up. Each room houses a certain number of enemies that you'll need to capture before you can move on to the next area, and many of them are lifted directly from the movie. So of course there's Slimer, but you'll also be going up against the Jogging Ghost, the Bathtub Slime, the Scolari Brothers, the Severed Heads in the subway system, which is especially gruesome, and of course you'll have a final showdown with the one and only Vigo of Carpathia. This makes for gameplay that's easy to get the hang of, and it's very fun, though there's a total lack of any kind of power-ups, and all of the Ghostbusters play the exact same, so it doesn't really matter who you pick. which also means that there's not much variety to the gameplay. So after you clear it a time or two, it'll probably be a while before you come back to it. But it's great while it lasts. The visuals are also pretty decent, all things considered, but I especially love the adorable chibi designs of all the characters. Hal was working with some really limited tools, but it's still really easy to tell who each character is meant to represent. Except maybe for Winston, who they decided to color blue for some reason. So I guess we can just assume that he got slimed by a blue ghost or something. Anyway, aside from that, I also really like the soundtrack in this game, which is mostly original tunes, but a couple of the songs from the movie's soundtrack have been reworked into 8 bits. And this is definitely the best version of the Ghostbusters theme song to grace the NES. So while it's a fairly short and easy game, New Ghostbusters 2 is still really fun and light years better than any of the other games I just talked about, though I did think some improvements could be made. Then I played the Game Boy version and I was pleasantly surprised to say the least. This version was also developed by HAL Laboratory and I'd actually never played it before I decided to make this video, because I had always assumed it'd just be a shittier version of the NES game, as it was also published by Activision in North America. But it has a lot more in common with New Ghostbusters 2, featuring a similar visual style and gameplay. But there are a lot of differences that actually make this game a bit better than its NES counterpart. For starters, you still choose 2 characters to play as initially, but many times throughout the game you can swap characters in and out when you encounter them in different stages. Meaning if one is low on health, you can put him on the bench for a while. And when swapping characters, you can also get some cool power-ups, like a super trap, which allows you to suck up ghosts without having to stun them first, or the slime blower, which immediately eliminates any ghost that you hit with it. So right away, there's quite a bit more to the gameplay than in the NES. And this game is at least twice as long, featuring 3 separate areas, each consisting of a bunch of floors that need to be cleared before moving on. You do this, of course, by catching ghosts, with each floor containing a certain number of ghosts that need to be captured before the stage is cleared. And at the end of each area, there's a boss battle where the game shifts to a top-down shooter. In addition to being a much longer game though, this is also a bit more of a challenge. Which I know I said the NES game was really easy, but a lot of the challenge here comes from the fact that aside from the boss fights, your CPU character can also take damage, which does get to be a real pain in the ass at times. In the NES game, they're completely invincible, so you never really have to worry too much about where they are. But here, you have to be especially mindful of them because if they die, that costs you a continue, which you only have a limited supply of. That minor frustration aside though, I absolutely love this game. I dare say I enjoyed it more than the NES game, though the visuals aren't quite as nice and the soundtrack is also considerably weaker, not featuring any of the reworked music from the NES game. So it's a bit of a trade-off when playing one or the other. Your best bet though, just play them both, as they are some excellent games. Much better than anything Activision or anyone else had to offer. And between the two of them, I'd say Ghostbusters 2 was treated pretty well by HAL Laboratories.
Two in the box.
Ready to go.
We be fast and
They be slow.
In 1986, the year of my glorious birth, the Real Ghostbusters animated series started airing in the US, where it would last for 7 seasons, finally coming to an end in 1991. And to say that this was a popular series would be a massive understatement, as it was one of the most popular kids' cartoons of the mid and late 80s, right up there with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And likewise, it spawned a super successful toy line that had some pretty wacky and sometimes totally pointless inclusions. But I, like most kids back then, had at least a couple of Ghostbusters figures in my toy collection. In fact, I was such a fan of the show that for my 6th birthday, we sprang for the Real Ghostbusters party set, with hats, plates and napkins, party blowers, stuff like that. And it was a seriously awesome birthday. Anyway, such a popular series was obviously gonna spawn some video games. But where I was expecting that there would be a bunch, kinda like TMNT, surprisingly, there were actually only 2. The first game was developed by Data East and released in 1987. Simply titled The Real Ghostbusters, it's actually a conversion of a Japanese arcade game called Make-You Hunter G, which itself was essentially a Ghostbusters knockoff, as Data East didn't have the licensing rights to release a Ghostbusters game in Japan. Which is why, despite being an officially licensed game, it doesn't feature any of the characters from the show, or any of the ghost designs apart from Slimer, of course. Because I guess you just can't have a Ghostbusters game without him. Even if you don't have any, Ghostbusters. In terms of gameplay, this is a fairly straightforward top-down run-and-gun, where you can play solo or co-op, and the goal of each stage is simply to make it to the end and defeat a boss character. After which, all of the ghosts you defeated in that stage are tallied up for a score bonus. Your main weapon is obviously your proton pack, though the beam is pretty short and not very powerful at the start of the game, but its range can be increased and it can be made stronger by grabbing the power-ups that defeated enemies leave behind. And you also have a super attack that deals big damage to all of the enemies on screen, as well as the occasional force field for some brief invulnerability. The main issue with this game though is that it's pretty damn difficult, making it almost impossible to maintain a powered up beam for very long, as taking even a single hit costs you a life and saps all of your power-ups. And at all times there are tons of enemies, projectiles, and obstacles swarming all over you, meaning that unless you're an absolute wizard at this game, you can plan on dying almost constantly. It's one of those quarter munchers that sucks you in with its fairly easy first stage and simple controls, but after that it really starts to kick your ass. Luckily though, if you're playing on an emulator like MAME or Final Burn, a lack of quarters is no longer a barrier to seeing the end of this game. Which never would have happened when I was a kid because I could never make it beyond stage 2 of this 10-stage game. Also, as an aside, and I don't think anyone really cares anyway, but there's absolutely no story to this game. The Ghostbusters just drive away in the Ecto-1 and suddenly they're in environments that look like maybe the Ghost World or some other supernatural place, but there's really no explanation for where they are or why they'd be there, other than that they're catching ghosts. And after clearing the game, it says you saved the city of New York, even though it doesn't look like you're ever actually in New York. Again, this is a consequence of the fact that this game was also developed to be an entirely separate game that looked like the Ghostbusters at a glance but didn't really have any relation to the show or the movies. Despite how tough it is though, this is actually a pretty fun game. After all, you can never go wrong with running around, zapping ghosts, and collecting power-ups, even if it does feel insanely cheap at times. A punishing game, but a pretty good time, especially if you have a second player handy. The graphics and sound, on the other hand, are both kinda mediocre. The stages and characters look okay, I guess, but there's kind of a nondescript, generic-looking quality to everything that just doesn't really scream Ghostbusters to me. And while it's always nice to hear the theme song, in this case, it's way overused, playing pretty much throughout the entire game non-stop, which gets old pretty quick. And the sound effects are kind of irritating at best, and just straight up annoying at worst. The powered up proton beam being especially harsh on your ears. So I don't know, maybe play this one with the sound off while listening to the score from the movie. Overall, not a terrible game, but it certainly could have been a lot better. A proper 4-player game with all of the Ghostbusters and at least some kind of story to follow would have been really cool. But instead we got something that's enjoyable in short bursts, but ultimately doesn't really do the license justice. And though there wasn't a console port of this game, it was released by Activision on a number of microcomputers, like the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64. I ended up giving the Amiga version a try, and as you might expect, it's just a much shittier version of the arcade game, with worse graphics and sound, and much choppier gameplay. So I'd advise not even bothering with this version and just grab yourself a ROM of the arcade original if you just have to get your Real Ghostbusters fix.
The Real Ghostbusters will return after these messages.
There's a new cereal in the neighborhood. Ghostbusters! Marshmallow ghost, fruit flavored only. Ghostbusters! With milk and juice and toast, a nutritious breakfast with the ghosts.
Ghostbusters! We now return to the Real Ghostbusters.
The other Real Ghostbusters game was a bit of a surprise to me, as prior to working on this video, I'd never even heard of it. But it was released on the Game Boy in North America in 1993, a full 2 years after the series was discontinued. And I also learned that in Europe this is actually called Garfield Labyrinth, and in Japan it's Mickey Mouse 4, though all of them play the exact same, just with swapped out character sprites. And this game was developed by Kemco, the same developer as the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle series, which made a lot of sense to me as soon as I started playing it, because this is yet another puzzle platformer, and it's actually a pretty good one. Way better than I was expecting anyway. You only have one playable character, which in this case is Peter, and in each stage you're tasked with finding a certain number of stars, which then grants you the key needed to open the door, which allows you to progress to the next stage. Which is very simple at first, but eventually the stages do start to get pretty tricky. And this is a surprisingly long game, with something like 50 stages to play through. But there is thankfully a pretty simple password system. Or you can do what I did and just play with save states. In order to find most of the stars though, you'll need to destroy the blocks that stand in your way. And you do this by zapping them with your proton pack, which you think would also be effective against enemies, but it actually has no effect on them at all. The only way to take out enemies in this game is by using the bombs that you find scattered around each stage, which again makes sense if you're playing as Garfield or Mickey Mouse, but instead we've got a Ghostbusters game where the proton pack, the one weapon that's effective against ghosts, is completely useless for anything other than clearing blocks from your path. Despite that weird design choice though, this is a fun, moderately challenging little puzzle platformer. And as you progress a bit, it does give you some real brain teasers. I actually ended up spending quite a lot of time with this game, and I still plan to go back to it as I've yet to clear all 50 stages. The graphics and sound are also both pretty good. It's a Game Boy game, so I wasn't expecting much, but at least Peter is somewhat recognizable as who he's supposed to be. The stages vary in their designs, and there are even some pretty cool enemy designs, though they could just as well be in any other game. And the soundtrack, while not being anything particularly memorable, does feature some catchy little tunes. So again, this was a very pleasant surprise. A game I'd never heard of before and was almost certain was going to suck turned out to be pretty decent. And I can recommend this game to puzzle platformer fans, even if for all intents and purposes, it's not really a Ghostbusters game.
Slimer, I hate to say it, but you look marvelous. Now that's what I call a happy ending.
In 1997, an entirely new Ghostbusters series began airing in North America, and that series was Extreme Ghostbusters, which is in fact a sequel series to the Real Ghostbusters, featuring Egon as a college professor, and apparently the only one of the original crew that bothered to stick around in New York after business dried up, due to a lack of paranormal activity in the city. When things start to get spooky all over again, Egon decides to take 4 of his students under his wing and train them as the next generation of Ghostbusters. And though I'd heard of this show as a kid, I have no recollection of actually watching it. So in preparation for this video, I watched a handful of its 40 episodes, and I've gotta say, it's not half bad. The animation is decent, the stories are on par with what was in the original Real Ghostbusters, and the voice cast is fantastic, featuring industry veterans like Tara Strong, Reno Romano, Billy West, Jason Marsden, and the one and only Alfonso Ribeiro.
It finally happened! Somebody pinch me!
This is a pretty cool show. And of course, anything that was rebooted in the 90s just has to be extreme. So the characters have much more elaborate designs, and they're packing all kinds of upgraded weapons and vehicles in their fight against the supernatural forces plaguing New York City. So after watching the show for a bit, I was all hyped up to try out some of the games. But that hype quickly turned to regret. The first game I played is the simply titled Extreme Ghostbusters on the Game Boy Color, which was released in 2001. And more than anything, I found this game to be pretty boring. It's essentially an action platformer, and the basic gist is that in each stage you're tasked with finding and eliminating a handful of specific ghosts, as you might expect. And you can swap between all 4 of the main characters. But in this case, the stages are very large and a bit confusing, making the process of finding the ghosts more difficult than you might expect. A simple side-scrolling action game would have done just fine, but here you'll be jumping, climbing, and searching every little nook and cranny of a stage to find those damn ghosts. And in between are a bunch of smaller enemies that can be easily taken out with your proton pack. But you also have limited energy for it, so you'll need to pick up proton canisters to refill it. Otherwise, it'll be impossible to actually trap the ghosts and finish the level. You can pick up some other items though, which help you out in various ways. The most useful of which being the PKE meter, which points you in the direction of the nearest ghost. But generally speaking, this is a very slow-moving and lackluster platformer that occasionally gets pretty frustrating when it's not very clear where you're supposed to go. Again, something a little more straightforward that plays a bit faster would have been appreciated. As it is, I didn't bother to finish this game because I was just getting too bored with it. It's not the worst game I've ever played, but it really isn't very good. On top of which, the visuals are kind of ugly. I know the GBC isn't exactly known for its graphical prowess, but this is pretty bad. The sound design though I thought was okay. The soundtrack has a very 80s sort of Commodore 64 sound to it, which I like quite a bit. So at least in that regard it gets a pass. But aside from that, I had a pretty miserable time with this game. That was followed up a year later in 2002 with Extreme Ghostbusters Code Ecto 1 for the Game Boy Advance. And this is a considerably better game, though still not exactly what I would call a great game. It's essentially what I said I wanted with the GBC game, being a fairly simple and straightforward action platformer, where you play as Eduardo and Kylie, and you have the ability to swap between the 2 characters whenever you want. And they both feature some unique attributes that make them better suited to different scenarios. Kylie is the faster and more agile of the 2, and she utilizes a rapid-fire attack and can carry ghost traps, which really come in handy for one-shotting enemies. While Eduardo uses a more traditional proton pack and has access to a limited supply of bombs, which are often necessary for clearing your path forward or gaining access to hidden areas. And if you want to find all of the game's hidden power-ups and point bonuses, you'll need to do quite a lot of switching back and forth between the 2 characters. There's also a bit of exploration to be done here, as some of the stages do open up quite a bit. But for the most part, this is a fairly standard get from point A to point B kind of action platformer, where you'll want to grab as many power-ups and point bonuses as you can on your way to a boss battle at the end of the stage. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it is a lot more enjoyable than the Game Boy Color game. In between the platforming stages, though, are driving stages in the Ecto 1, which I honestly could have done without. I've just never been a fan of this kind of top-down driving gameplay. But aside from that, this is at least a decent little platformer. The visuals, though, are not very good, looking pretty damn muddy for the most part, though I know that wouldn't be as much of an issue on a much smaller screen. And the sound design is likewise very lackluster, with the soundtrack in particular being very bland, low energy, and forgettable. This is also a fairly easy game, and it clocks in at about 90 minutes or so to finish. And despite its shortcomings in the presentation department, I did have some fun with it. So Code Ecto 1 is another instance where it could have definitely been better, but it also could have been a lot worse. The final game based on this series is called Ghostbusters: The Ultimate Invasion, which was released on the PS1 in 2004, a full 7 years after the series ended its television run, and way late into the lifespan of the PS1, actually being one of the last games released on the console, and only getting a release in PAL regions. And as you might expect, this is a very cheap feeling and looking game that really does have that late era PS1 vibe going for it, where it just feels like you're playing something that was put together in a matter of days. As you can see, this is a shooting gallery / light gun style game where you can play as all 4 of the Extreme Ghostbusters, each with varying stats in their speed, how much damage they deal to enemies, and how much damage they can absorb. And the basic gameplay is essentially just a ripoff of Time Crisis, where to avoid taking damage, you can duck behind cover, and this is also how you reload your weapon, which comes in 2 varieties. You can either use a rapid-fire shot, which deals less damage but uses up less proton energy, or a more traditional proton beam, which uses up more energy but takes enemies down a bit faster. And each stage does feature a time limit, which often doesn't leave much room for error, so you have to be careful with how much time you're spending in cover. And sprinkled throughout the game are a few boss battles, where the bosses are essentially just like the regular enemies, but they can absorb a lot more damage. And that's about it. This is a real no frills kind of game. Just blast enemies and jump from one stage to the next with the occasional cutscene thrown in. Though I use that term very loosely, as it's just a bunch of still frames from the show over some text. And overall, this is definitely one of, if not the most boring light gun style games I've ever played. One reason being that this type of game is obviously way more fun with an actual gun peripheral, preferably in an arcade setting, but also because the design of this game is just so bland and cheap looking. It takes a little over an hour to get through, and you will be seeing the same handful of cardboard cutout enemies in featureless 3D environments all throughout the game. And aside from the boss battles, which themselves are as bare bones as boss battles get, there's never anything introduced to shake up the gameplay a bit. Just shoot the same 2 or 3 enemies over and over again until the stage just sort of ends. Rinse, repeat. No enemy variety, no stage variety, no real detail or flair to the visuals, and the soundtrack is the most generic, bland, early 2000s quasi-techno slop that plays on an infinite loop. So needless to say, I did not enjoy playing through this game. A Ghostbusters light gun game isn't a bad instinct. I can imagine a scenario where if done right, this could have been pretty fun. But as it is, this game just plain sucks. If you're only gonna play one game based on Extreme Ghostbusters, I recommend it be the GBA game. After this though, it would be quite a while before anyone made another attempt at making a Ghostbusters game. But when someone finally did, they set out to make the best damn Ghostbusters game that anyone had ever seen.
Wasn't me this time, I swear it.
In 2009, Ghostbusters the video game was released for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, and was later re-released in HD for the PS4 and various other platforms, which is the version I played for this video. And it's one giant love letter to fans of the Ghostbusters, and serves nicely as a direct sequel to Ghostbusters 2. It was developed by Terminal Reality, who at the time were best known for developing the Blood Rain series of games, and the story was actually penned by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, being set in 1991 and featuring our heroes once again taking on the likes of Gozer and a whole host of recognizable ghosts from the first 2 movies, ultimately revealing a much more sinister plot to merge the real world with the ghost world, set in motion by the maniacal Ivo Shandor, who has plans to become a god and lord over a hellscape of his own creation. You play as a new recruit to the Ghostbusters, a nameless, silent protagonist referred to only as the Rookie or the New Guy, which admittedly is a little disappointing, not being able to play as the actual Ghostbusters, though you do fight alongside them through a myriad of crazy scenarios, even going into the mysterious ghost world, which is kind of reminiscent of the original plans for a 3rd Ghostbusters movie, which would have featured the guys going into hell itself to fight demonic forces. And you also get to visit a number of iconic locations from the first movie, like the Sedgwick Hotel and the New York Public Library, taking on the likes of Slimer, Stay Puft, the Grey Lady, and even a giant Slore, a creature that was only briefly mentioned in the film, which, needless to say, is pretty damn cool. The icing on the cake is that most of the principal cast from the first film returned to voice their characters, including all 4 of the Ghostbusters, Annie Potts reprising her role as receptionist Janine Melnitz, Brian Doyle Murray, who played a psych doctor in the second movie, is now the mayor of New York, and they even brought back Max von Sydow to provide the voice of Vigo the Carpathian, whom can be found in the Ghostbusters firehouse, warning of impending destruction and doom.
I see the evil of the times to come. 3 more faraway wars will come, and they will tarnish even the undisputed glory of the first
Ghostbusters, what do you want?
Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention perhaps the most important inclusion to the cast. The one and only William Atherton returns to play the role of everyone's favorite representative of the EPA, Mr. Walter Peck.
Yes, it's true. This man has no dick.
So obviously, before even getting to the gameplay, there is a ton of fan service in this game, and Ramis and Aykroyd clearly wrote it with the fans of the series in mind. And that was, and still is, a big selling point for this game. While admittedly, not everyone delivers an A+ performance, having most of the cast back and featuring a plot that expounds on some of the themes touched upon in the films really made me happy as someone who's loved the Ghostbusters since I was maybe 4 years old. Plus, this is also the last time that Harold Ramis would play the role of Egon Spengler before his unfortunate passing in 2014. And yeah, of course the game isn't going to be much fun if all it has to offer is fan service. But still, gameplay aside, this is an important and significant piece of Ghostbusters history.
The Ghostbusters! Hey fellas, what are you doing here? What am I doing here? Where is here?
You were the victim of a trans-dimensional possession, Your Honor.
What's that mean?
An evil ghost was walking around in your body for a few months.
Whoa! Did anyone notice? Well, how's my approval rating?
Well, you got reelected.
Now, about that gameplay. It is, for the most part, pretty damn good. But there are sections that are absolutely frustrating as all hell. The basic gist is that you, as a new Ghostbuster, join the rest of the team on their investigations and, of course, bust all of the ghosts that you come across. Initially, the only weapon you have at your disposal is the classic proton pack, which, as you blast ghosts with it, it whittles down their health bar until you can lasso them. Then it's just a simple matter of throwing out your trap to suck them up and earn yourself some much needed cash to purchase upgrades, which you can also earn by cataloging ghosts with the PKE meter and recovering haunted items scattered around each stage. Eventually though, you get access to several more weapons, like the slime blower and 2 other types of energy projectiles that can rapid fire or freeze enemies in place. And all of your weapons come in handy against different enemies and can be upgraded to deal more damage and consume less energy, which is great because you don't need ammo in this game. But overusing your weapons can cause overheating, which means you'll have to wait a couple of seconds for your pack to cool down before you can go back on the attack. These mechanics work pretty well for the most part, and it is a great feeling to be lassoing and trapping ghosts just like in the movies, especially with the rest of the Ghostbusters there cheering you on. And hey, they even used an idea from the old NES Ghostbusters game, with a giant ghost trap called the Super Slammer on top of the Ecto-1, which makes catching ghosts a hell of a lot easier.
Pow, freak! Stand up for the church. One more in the bottle!
What? Big soap shortage in the afterlife, guys?
Look at their change. You're only encouraging them.
Pinkman, we need to have a talk about tolerance.
Scattered throughout the game is a series of boss battles against some baddies that you'll recognize and some that were created exclusively for the game, but definitely give off some classic Real Ghostbusters kind of vibes, such as the Black Widow Spider-Woman who can climb the walls and disappear into puffs of smoke, or the ghost of an old sea captain that floods the entire floor of the hotel and eventually has to be sent packing to the containment unit. And of course, there have to be some classic boss battles against the likes of Gozer, who once again returns in the form of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and the aforementioned Slore, which you fight in a chamber located on Ivo Shandor's secret island, covered in black slime, which apparently is the color slime that results from contact between the two worlds. Ultimately, you'll even take on Ivo Shandor himself, who has become something of a demigod after absorbing an epic amount of spiritual energy. But hey, these are the Ghostbusters, so it's not like they haven't defeated world-ending interdimensional threats before.
We eat gods for breakfast.
The most frustrating aspect of the gameplay, and really the only part that I didn't like, oddly enough, comes in the form of the other Ghostbusters, as this game does not feature any health power-ups of any kind. Instead, when a character takes too much damage, they fall to the ground in agony and need to be revived by one of the other Ghostbusters. Now this gets very annoying at times, considering that oftentimes it only takes a few hits to put someone on the floor. And when you're in an especially intense battle, constantly having to halt your attack to revive your allies that are almost constantly being knocked down can drive you to madness. Or worse yet, when you're knocked to the ground and have to rely on help that never comes, as the CPU here is sometimes a complete moron. And if all of the Ghostbusters are taken out of commission, it's back to the last checkpoint you go. Sometimes you're joined by the whole crew, so it's not so difficult to avoid a total loss, but there are other times where it's just you and one partner, and it's times like these where dying is almost painfully easy. And yes, you will die over and over again, and you may hurl a few naughty words at your TV, but a bit of frustration in an otherwise very fun game that lets you live out one of your fondest childhood playground memories is a comparatively small price to pay. So the story, especially for a Ghostbusters fan, is very enjoyable, and the gameplay, despite some shortcomings, is for the most part very fun and also very enjoyable. A squad-based shooter with all of the Ghostbusters, after all, was a pretty solid idea. The final icing on the cake, though, is the outstanding visuals and sound design. The character models, for the most part, look really good, and every environment is loaded with detail, whether that be in the living world or in the ghost world, which looks especially gnarly. Or my personal favorite, when Central Park turns into one giant spooky cemetery. Very cool indeed. Even just exploring the firehouse and finding all of the cool little Easter eggs is a lot of fun. And as you'd expect, there is a huge variety of ghosts, monsters, and other various enemies to take on. And they too feature some very cool designs. And while this was already a good looking game upon its initial release, the HD upgrade looks leagues better. The sound design also gets a big thumbs up from me, again featuring voice work from the original cast, but also featuring a lot of the original sound effects and music taken straight from the films. And the new music composed specifically for the game also fits the Ghostbusters vibe to a T. So when it comes to the visuals and sound, I really have no complaints at all. Now there is another version of this game that was made for the PSP, Wii, and I believe the PS2 back in 2009. And it features the same story and even all of the voice work from the PS3 game. But the visuals are obviously scaled down quite a bit, going for a much more cartoonish look. And the gameplay has also been simplified a bit. I honestly haven't actually completed this version, playing it for the first time just to get some footage for this video. But from what I did play, I'd say it's also pretty good. Definitely a fun game and a good fit for Ghostbusters fans. But it doesn't really hold a candle to its PS3 counterpart, and certainly not to the PS4 version, which gets my pick for the best Ghostbusters game that we've ever gotten to date. And honorable mentions go to the Sega Genesis game, Ghostbusters 2 on the Game Boy, and New Ghostbusters 2 on the NES. As for the worst game, that's a tough call, but for sure the original NES game, Ghostbusters 2 on the Amiga and Atari 2600, and Extreme Ghostbusters on the PS1 all have to be considered bottom of the barrel trash that deserve immediate banishment to the Ghost Realm. Avoid them like you'd avoid a giant slore. But that's about all the time I have for Ghostbusters games. Some of them were a ton of fun, and some of them just kinda hurt my brain. But the Ghostbusters brand is still alive and well, So who knows, maybe someday we'll get a new Ghostbusters game that tops all of the ones that came before it. A guy can dream anyway. So until next time.
Sometimes shit happens, someone has to deal with it, and who are you gonna call?
Yeah.